We won't tell.
Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Kelly Rambert, and I'm the Outreach Librarian here at the Southfield Public Library. And it is my pleasure tonight, as we wrapping up Women's History Month, we're about to go into Poetry Month. So it's a wonderful blend as we welcome Jean Alicia Elster here to the library this evening. She's the author of 3 wonderful books, and she's going to tell us about how the story has continued from children's books into now the latest one, How It Happens, which is a young adult book as the family has grown up. So join me in welcoming Jean Alicia.
Hi there. Thank you. I'm
Welcome.
happy to be back to school. It's been a few years. The last time I was in person at the library, so I'm glad to be here virtually and to meet Kelly and Eugenia and I met in another life when she was in Pontiac. So now she's in South.
Yes.
Glad to be here. I'm glad to share. I just when I was talking about speaking tonight, and Eugenia asked me, well, could I talk about the connection between the first 2 books and How It Happens? And so that's what I want to do tonight. But first, I thought I'd give your readers and viewers a little bit about my background. And I am a lifelong Michigander, and I was educated in Detroit Public Schools. I went to the University of Michigan, where I got a degree in English. So if there are any Go Blue out there. And so then I went to law school. I went to the University of Detroit Law School and practiced law for a few years. In fact, I still pay my bar dues, but I am a professional writer now. And I started writing because when I got married and had kids, I wanted to do something home-based. And it's pretty common now for folks to work from home, but at the time, it wasn't that common. And so I fell back on my English degree and just started doing a lot of editing. I wrote some essays for some national publications, and I really cut my teeth as a writer for children. I kind of stumbled into it. I started writing testing passages for a national testing service. And that's where I developed my motto as a writer for young people, which is do no harm. And I got that motto because when you're writing these testing passages, you can't cover any topic, nothing negative, nothing about death, divorce, injury, nothing that would make the students feel bad and not do their best on the test. So my motto is do no harm. And all of my books, I want to have, whether they're the middle grade, I have a series of picture story books, or even the young adult, How It Happens. I want my readers to come away feeling that they can conquer something in their lives in a positive, affirming way. They can come back stronger, a stronger person, not just a stronger reader in the book, but a person in general. So that's that background.
I have to interrupt. That is such a wonderful motto and philosophy.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, well, it has served me well as a writer and as my books develop. The first 2 books, the idea for those, first, Who's Jim Hines, came to me. I have a cousin whose father is one of my aunt's second husband. So she became one of my cousins later in life. She was a teenager. And so I grew up hearing this story about Jim Hines. My grandfather had a wood hauling business, and I heard about this driver, Jim Hines. Well, my cousin, she heard about him when she was much older. She was like a young adult writer. She illustrates books for children, and she lives in New York. And she said, my aunt, her stepmother, told her about Who's Jim Hines. She said, you got to write about Jim Hines. And so that's how that story came into being. The colored car I was talking to my oldest aunt, my mother's oldest sister, and I do a lot of oral histories, but this one was more a more subdued oral history. This kind of was, it just happened. We were talking, and she told me about an instance where she was, they were going south to Clarksville, Tennessee. That's my grandmother's home place. And they had been on this very fancy first class train car. They got on the train depot on Michigan Avenue, and they had tea, sandwiches, and these plush seats. And then when they got to Cincinnati, which is right there on the border with Kentucky, right there at the Mason-Dixon line, they had to leave their very plush, all of the Black passengers had to leave their very plush first class car and get on to what was called the colored car. And that was a very, very traumatic experience for her. And what touched me was that even she was very much a middle-aged woman, and just the trauma of that experience, it touched me how it stayed with her. And so that was the impetus for me writing that book, because I wanted to share with today's readers just what that experience was like and how it affected her later on. So that's how I got to write those two books. But the story behind how it happens had been brewing within my head, even when I was writing those first two books. And so I want to read a little bit from the prologue of how it happens, because I was really a toddler when those ideas first started brewing in my head. So I want to read a little bit from the prologue, and then I'll talk a little bit more after that. Grandma, are you white? It's one of my earliest memories as a toddler, standing in my grandparents' kitchen, looking up at my grandmother's face as she sat at the kitchen table and asking her if she's white. I had no idea what I was asking or what that term white meant when it was applied to another person. Obviously, I knew that her skin was very much lighter, brighter, my grandmother would say, than my brown skin. And I had obviously heard that word bandied about as adults talked around me. But at that age, I had no concept of race or ethnic heritage. I just knew that she looked different from the other family members that I interacted with. I also did not know this. Her color represented a vivid reminder of the history of racial relationships in the American South as it relates to the sexual interactions between Blacks and whites and the resulting offspring that did often come from those unions. That history is fraught with complexities. Now, any sexual encounter that occurs without the consent of one of the parties, or that occurs after a party says no, is rape, period. And even more compelling are those instances where a party is afraid to say no, or when they know that saying no is not an option. It is still rape. And the situation and its consequences become all the more chilling. This book begins in the post-Reconstruction era of American history, in the year my grandmother was born in 1890 in Clarksville, Tennessee. It incorporates many of the snippets of family and social history that my grandmother shared with me while I was a young child and later while growing up. As a child, I did not know the meaning of or the social and familial impact of many of the seemingly innocuous tales she shared with me. But what became clear to me as I reached adulthood and began to truly absorb much of what she had told me was that even though those post-Reconstruction race laws have since the 1960s been repealed or struck down by judicial venues all the way up to the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, the effects of the race-based societal and sexual double standards and injustices that emanated from those laws are still an ingrained part of our American culture. The results will continue to be felt in this country for generations to come. Okay, so the ideas and questions behind how it happens were brewing when I was a toddler. And that's why I began reading from the prologue there. And because my interest in this story of my family's history began when I was a young child, and I noticed that my grandmother didn't look like everyone else, I incorporated that into Who's Jim Hines and the Colored Car. So I thought I would read a bit from both of those books, how I incorporated my grandmother's color, her light skin, into these books. Now, in Who's Jim Hines, I talk about it at the very beginning, and I also mention it at the end. So I'm going to read toward the end. My grandfather and the kids had gone to a business that sold live chickens, and they were bringing a live chicken home for my grandmother to cook for dinner. It didn't take long for a crowd to form around the truck. Onlookers pointed and watched as Doug tried to open the bag while his father struggled to get the flapping, pecking chicken back into it. The girls were still screaming. All of them were coughing because there were chicken feathers in the air. Doug could hear some folks saying, "What is going on there? Is he hurting those kids? Are those his children? Should someone call the police?" Finally, they got the chicken back in the bag. Doug's father tied the bag shut tight. Folks backed away as he got out of the cab carrying the burlap bag. He threw the chicken into the back of the truck where he hauled the wood and tried to tie it down. "Is everything all right? Are those your kids? Are you okay?" Yes, we're fine. The chicken got loose is all. They're my children. They're fine," he answered them all at once. Then came a man's surly voice from the others. Doug heard it from where he sat in the cab. He couldn't quite make out what the man said. He turned and looked out the window. The girls leaned up against him and watched too. The man continued, "Their mother must be pretty high yellow for you to be the daddy of these brown-skinned youngins like that. I bet their mother's got some nice, long, good hair." There was a gasp in the crowd. Doug's father, still outside the truck, turned in the direction of the voice. "A dark-skinned gal's not good enough for you, huh?" the man asked. Doug's father didn't answer. "I said," the man continued. "I heard you," Douglas Ford said flatly. By then, he had found the man's face and stared him down. "I won't have that kind of talk in front of my children." He spoke methodically. "You have something to say about my family? You say it to me in private. In fact, we can step over there to the side and talk about it right now if you'd like." Doug knew his father wouldn't fight. His father didn't believe in fighting. He had often preached to the children against it. He said there were always better ways to work things out. But the man didn't know that about his father. The man backed down. Doug heard him mumble something and walked away. His father stood there by the truck for a while, following the man with his eyes. Then he got back behind the steering wheel and started the engine. They pulled off, and Doug watched from the window as the crowd broke up. The girls sat stock still in the cab and didn't say a word. It was a long, quiet ride home. Okay, then I'm going to read a section from The Colored Car, and this is a portion where they're taking a streetcar downtown. Patsy looked around the streetcar. There were ladies, both colored and white, sitting nearby who were also wearing white gloves. There were Polish women with their heads covered in bright, flowery babushkas. There were men in overalls carrying lunch pails. And then it was happening again. One thing Patsy always noticed when they took the streetcar downtown, some of the people stared at her and her sisters, Doug too when he came along with them, and they especially stared at her mother, especially May Ford. Laura noticed too on this ride. She said to Jean, "They're staring at Mama's hat." "Mama, why are they staring at your hat?" Jean asked. "Shush now, girls," their mother said. But Patsy knew they were not staring at her hat. Strangers on the streetcar were staring at their mother because her skin was light. She looked white. She was not brown-skinned like Doug and her daughters. No one ever said anything directly to the children or their mother, but Patsy knew why they stared. One time on another ride, Patsy thought the people sitting in the row of seats directly behind them were whispering about them. She heard the words yellow woman, brown babies, black-skinned man. Patsy had asked her mother if those people were talking about her. May Ford turned and looked the people square in the eye. Then she turned back and said to Patsy, "No, baby, they have better things to talk about." Okay, so those were some of the instances that where I brought in the mother, May Ford, her light skin, into the books. But my grandmother also told me stories from her childhood that made, well, when I was a child, I just listened to him, and she told me about a judge, a white judge, and how he used to purchase all of her school books. And she told me how every fall, right before the start of school, right after Labor Day, a package would come, and it would be wrapped in brown paper and tied in string, and she would open it up, and they would be full of all of the school books she needed. So they'd be full of her school books. They would have notebooks, the little composition books. They would have number 2 pencils, everything she would need for school. And this judge purchased for her, she was the first person when she got a little older, she was the first person in town to actually own in their house a treadle sewing machine. And she told me tales about her father. This was her biological father, how he worked for that judge. And he would work hard for that judge and go back on Sundays and work some more because the judge promised him that he would remember him in his will. And she also told me tales of how she went to Tennessee State University. It was the first Black college. It was a teacher's college for Black students, colored students, they called them. And someone had paid her way for that school. And she told me tales about her years as a teacher in Clarksville, Tennessee, at the colored school. There was one colored schoolhouse. And so as I got older and I had listened to these stories and entered my adult years, and my sister and I, we started talking about, because my grandmother would tell her these stories also. And then it dawned on us. We had like an aha moment that, oh my gosh, we thought about her color. We thought about this white judge. This judge was her father. It dawned on us that that was the connection there. She never told us, but that was the connection. That's what we realized. And so once I realized that, I wanted to dig deeper. And having nothing more than this white judge's name, and it had been passed along to us from the generations. We had my great grandmother's name, the year my grandmother was born, and my husband, who's a historian, he took this information, sent an email down to the genealogy department at the Clarksville, Montgomery County Public Library in Clarksville, Tennessee. Now, in the South, genealogy is really, really big. And when you go down there, one of the first things people will ask you is, who are your people? You know, what's your history? What's behind you? And so my husband and I took a trip down there to this genealogy library. And when we got there, the genealogist there, his name is Tim Pulley, and he was so helpful. He's the first person that I thank in the acknowledgments of the book. But he had a treasure trove of information there. He had a stack of books. Well, it turns out that my great-great-great-grandfather, so my grandmother's great-grandfather, was a senator for the Confederacy in Tennessee. So there are 2 or 3 books written about the family. And the genealogist had also found a will, the same will that my grandmother used to tell us about when we were growing up. He found marriage records, birth records. He found an obituary. So I had all of these documents, and when I read them, I was able to, that churned in me, I was able to piece together what became how it happens. And so I'm going to read from a part of chapter 1, because this is a part of how my grandmother came to being. Several days later in the late afternoon, Addie arrived at Tom Mitchell's door at the end of the hallway to clean his room. She knocked perfunctorily, and not expecting him to be there because it was not yet evening, she walked right in. Addie gasped when she saw Tom Mitchell sitting at his desk. She almost dropped the basket she held in her hand. If Mrs. Beatty finds out one of her boarders was still in his room when I entered, Addie quickly blurted out an apology. I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell. I'll come back later. She immediately backed out of the room, ready to close the door. Nonsense, Tom Mitchell said, putting his pen in the inkwell as he spoke. You don't have to do that. You can straighten things up while I'm here. I'll be working at my desk. Yes, sir, she said. She glanced over her shoulder and looked down the hall to see if anyone was watching her, but no one was there. She re-entered the room, closing the door behind her. She did not dare look over at Tom Mitchell as he sat at his desk, but she did not have to look at him to know that even though he was sitting there, he was not working. She could feel the force of his gaze upon her while she worked. He was staring at her while she moved about his room, and she knew it. She finished her work as quickly as she could. She just wanted to get out of that room and away from that man. Alone with a white man in one of her rooms. I just hope Mrs. Beatty never finds out. She'll have my job for sure. She quickly gathered Tom Mitchell's clothes up off the floor, his shirt and collar, his nightshirt and drawers, and filled the basket. There, now, I'm finished. She felt a wave of relief. Then, looking down at her basket, Addie walked down toward the door. But just as she started to pass Tom Mitchell, he reached out from where he sat at his chair and grabbed her arm firmly. Addie gasped and briefly held her breath, her eyes fixed on the basket. Oh my God, her body tensed. What's he gonna do? What's he gonna do to me? I'm sorry, really I am. I'm not gonna hurt you, Tom Mitchell said, as if reading her mind. Addie still looked down at the basket. She was breathing quickly. Look at me, Addie, he said softly, as if to coax her. She still looked away. I said, look at me. He spoke deliberately now. She raised her eyes from her basket and turned her head over toward him. Their eyes met. Are you afraid of me? He asked. He relaxed his hold on her arm. Yes, no, I don't know, sir, she answered, her chest heaving with each breath. Addie was frightened. Tom Mitchell let his hand drop from her arm. He stood up and cupped her face in his hands, looking deep into her eyes as she looked up at him. She cringed inside at the touch of his hands on her face. Don't be afraid, he said soothingly. I won't hurt you. Fact is, I think you're the prettiest thing I've ever laid eyes on. Thought so from the time I saw you trip up those steps with your basket of laundry. He smiled. Come on up here tomorrow when you finish your wash, he said. Come up around this time before the others come home. No one will know you're here. As Addie listened, she realized he was not going to do anything to her right then, and her breathing slowed down. But she remained silent. She felt as if she couldn't speak. You hear me? He asked. There was more silence. Tom dropped his hand from her face, but held her gaze. So this is how it happens. And now it's happening to me. There was only one answer that she could give. She knew that. Yes, Addie answered, her voice almost a whisper. Yes, sir. Addie broke the gaze and stepped away, quickly carrying her basket to the door. Tom followed close behind her. He stood in the doorway as she left the room. She heard his door close as she reached the top of the stairs.
Wow, that is
Oh,
powerful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Has it brought your since so much of this is rooted in your own family, what do your other family members think of this? Has it brought you all closer together?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, they all know I'm a writer, and I told them that I was working on this one book. And in fact, the next year after my husband and I went to Clarksville was a family reunion year that I was planning. So I did a little PowerPoint presentation of some of the documents I found. And so they knew the basis of this research. Well, one of my cousins, she said, Gran Ford, my grandmother, the daughter of this union, she said, Gran Ford worked hard to keep this part of her family, her background secret. She said, I don't know that she'd want you to write about this. And I told my cousin, I said, well, if she didn't want me to write about it, she wouldn't have told me about it. If she was trying to keep this a secret, she really wouldn't have told me about it. And come to find out, that particular cousin is now one of the biggest boosters for this book. She's telling everybody about it. She read it. She said she's reading it with that 1619 project, that book.
Oh,
She's
yes.
a lot out of it. So all of the other family members have been really supportive because they want to know more about what's going on. And they know, even though I'm fictionalizing it, the core of it is history. It happened. And in fact, one of my other cousins is really into this registry.com, where you get the DNA.
Oh.
One of those, she and my sister are really into it. And she heard from someone who is a white descendant of that particular family. And because, one of these matches came up. So I even have a DNA match. Before it was just the research. Now I've got the DNA matching for that family relationship. So the family has come along. They love it. As I said, that one cousin was very, she's very supportive now. So the family is very, very interested in it.
I'm so glad to hear that, that it's because it is so you could just tell even when you're reading it, it is so personal to you.
Well, my grandmother, she would tell us these stories, and she told us the same things over and over again. And I tell folks, because I took a lot of oral histories from my uncle when I was writing Who's Jim Hines, because it's based upon his interactions with his father in the woodyard and the trucking business. And I tell folks that I took several oral histories over the years at different family reunions, and I would ask the same questions over and over again, because you get different answers depending upon how the person feels that day, what they've just eaten, who they sat next to at the lunch, or just whatever. Certain things bring back different memories for those same questions. So I got a lot of information just from not just what my grandmother told me, but from what other family members told me they remembered, either from what my grandmother told them, or trips down to Clarksville when they were young, or when her sister would visit, things of that nature.
I love all the tips that you're giving us of ways to research your own family history. And that I love
Yes.
that you talk to people multiple times.
Yes. Well, you can invite me back. I give a workshop on oral history for young people.
Okay.
I do encourage them. A lot of young people think, oh, family reunions are boring, I don't want to go, or whatever. But those are prime times to really find out about your family history, and to really talk to relatives that maybe you didn't talk to, other than saying, hi, how are you doing? But to really to delve deep and to get some of these stories. And they're always willing to talk, and a lot of them, especially the older relatives, want to know that the younger people are interested in their lives and things that they've gone through. So I encourage people, young people, to do these family histories.
Yes, fortunately, working at the library, I have a lot of we have a lot of resources such as the genealogy, and
Yes.
one of my coworkers got me interested, and I looked up my because I don't know much about my father's side. I have nowhere to start because he had sisters and brothers by his father, and I'm wondering why this person's name is this and why grandma's name was something else. So just listening to their stories, because once they're gone, we lose a lot of that because no one wants to write that down. And even with my mom's stories, I make sure that I sit and listen to her sister. My mom is the second oldest out of eight. When her brother calls, I make sure I listen to his stories because they're the only ones that know that oral history as you were talking about. So, and I just discovered, I looked up my grandmother's, I think it was a census for her,
Mhm.
and it in her marriage license, and it listed her as her ethnicity as white. And so
Okay.
I went to ask my aunt. I texted her right away, and I said, "Why do they have grandma listed as white on her marriage? She got married here, and they were part of that migration that came up to work in the plant. My grandfather, and so my grandmother was from Arkansas. I believe my grandfather was from Mississippi, and I just want that intrigued me to learn more because why would they label her white on her marriage certificate here in the North?
Yes.
But and then my namesake is her mother, so I want to know more about those stories. And my mom would always say, they keep secrets, but my
Yes.
mom yes, and it's interesting to figure out the secret and who knows the secret, and how it connects back to me. So, and I
Keep.
always enjoy your storytelling, and that's what drew me to you, to have you come to the art center a few years ago, because I saw the video. I think it was for the Kresge Award, and I just loved the way you um, told story, how you told your story.
Thank you so much. Oh, that does my heart good. Writers love to hear that people care about what we say. And
Yes,
but keep searching your family history. Really, that is fascinating. I mean, that's a book right there. That you,
yeah. Kelly asked a really good question, because how do you not offend your family members, because there's some secrets that my mom she doesn't. I always say my dad protected me, and my mom, she wanted to make sure I was ready for this world, so she tells me the truth all the time, even if I don't want to hear it. So she said, oh no, this happened, and I think about her perspective most of the time, because the story she tell me, I think, wow, you really, do your other brothers and sisters know that that's your perspective, like that they didn't know that she had to help grandma with the, not just with the younger kids, but she had to help her with the finances, that she helped other older people on the street. And she said, she told someone the other day that she just loved listening to their stories,
oh,
because she would just go down and eat with them, or they would teach her how to cook. And so she said she just loved being around the older people because of their stories. And I think that sometimes that's just lost.
it's interesting because I found out when my husband and I were a young married couple and our kids were little, and we were in the block club of this neighborhood where we were the young people in the neighborhood. Most of our neighbors were retired and whatnot. So anyway, one of our neighbors just happened to mention that she was from Clarksville, Tennessee. And I said, oh, my grandmother is from there. I said, she was a teacher there. She says, was your grandmother Mrs. Ford? And I said, yes. And my goodness, she had been one of my grandmother's students.
Oh,
I mean, and she told me so. My grandmother was very strict, and you couldn't
mm-hmm.
move around in your. I mean, she just
Right.
so you never know where little snippets
Yes.
are going to come from.
And I thought I knew my grandmother. When you have your grandmother, you just think she just loved you and that she knew you. But at her funeral, we always say, you know, she wasn't a dignitary or not even a teacher, but she taught people, and her funeral was standing room only. Everyone was standing, and it was packed of people who had stories about her. So I just think storytelling is, I always say, I love a great story. So
Well, I tell you, you're in the right place to do that, being in a library, you know,
yes.
that's what, that's what libraries are for, just really to be repositories of our stories.
Hmm.
And, and I have a soft spot for libraries. In fact, when I speak at schools, I have a story that I share of some young people in South Africa who they did a very peaceful, joyful, but it was a protest march because they wanted to have more libraries and librarians. And I said, we take libraries for granted here in the United States. I said, but there are parts of the world where they don't have this,
Right.
even though our tax dollars pay for it, but you don't have to pay to get in and whatnot. And I just encourage people to take advantage of the libraries for reasons like that, because that's where our stories are 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 sheltered and treasured and passed along. So that's fabulous. I'm glad you and Kelly are there in the library, just and inviting people like me to come and
We
share.
meet some great people. Yes.
That's
Yes.
just that's great.
I was going to ask you, speaking about that, what do you think about the efforts to ban books that deal with race?
Yeah, of course, I'm saddened by that because, and a reporter from the Free Press called me up and asked me that same thing, and I'm saddened by it because, this is how we learn about one another. You really you can try to hide our history, but it's going to bubble up. You can try all you want. I know there were people used to try to burn down the records sometimes in the South when they found out
Hmm.
black blood and you can try to do all that, but the truth will come out, and stories never die. Stories will come
Right.
out. So people that are trying to ban books are doing a disservice not only to themselves but to their children and their grandchildren, and it's just going to make it that much harder for their children to find the truth, because their children will find it. We're curious.
Right. They will. Yes.
We're curious people. That's
Mhm.
just our curiosity, I think, has kept us alive over the eons. We're curious. Well, this didn't work. This way of making fire didn't work. How is another way I can make fire? Even from our ancestors. So you can ban a book, but that story's gonna come out in some other way. And so it's a sad thing, and I think it's dangerous in the sense that it just makes children that much more inquisitive about, well, what is this? What is this story?
Right.
Why look this way and not that way? Why does someone else have this history and I don't? So I hope, there have always been banned books or book banning endeavors, just because that's how some people think. But I hope that this kind of passes over, and that people will um, stand up against it. And in the communities where they're trying to do it, I hope other communities will try to make sure that it doesn't happen in their area,
Right.
because you can only do so much. Even if you have books that you tell your kids at home, I'd rather you may wait till you're a little bit older. Well, as soon as you
They'll find a way. Yes.
are going to read that book,
Hmm.
especially with the internet being the way it is, you can find just about anything. So, and actually, I would rather have students read something within the confines of a classroom or a library, where they can be guided and nurtured, and have events like this where the author is talking and answering questions, rather than them trying to figure it out on their own and maybe not understanding the nuances of that history. That's why I wrote what I did when I read the prologue, because I want people to understand this is how it was. This is the history, the socio-sexual history of, and that's why it's a young adult book, high school ages
Right.
and older. So that because they're thinking about these things, and any parent that thinks they aren't is up for a rude awakening, because they are. And I had there's a young blogger. Her name is Elena. Elena Reads is her blog.
Oh yes, we love Elena at the library.
Okay, so
Yes.
a review of how it happens. And
Mhm.
an intriguing new book by Jean Alicia Elster that explores racism through 3 generations of Black women. She said, it made me realize that racism doesn't seem to go away. It shapeshifts. I love the way she used that term.
Oh.
From one form to another, from slavery to segregation, and now unjustified police shootings and hate crimes, racism remains. And she just turned 13.
Mhm.
People are thinking about these things. It's on their mind. And at the age, and she was 12 when she read How It Happens. She turned 13 right after this. She wrote this review. And so young people are thinking about these things. So let's help them. Let's help them understand this part of American history. Let's help them understand why there are certain racial dynamics going on even today. And so, so all that, you got a long answer to your question about
Oh no, that was great. Thank you.
Now I've got a question for you. What advice do you give to people that want to write either a fiction story or their own memoir story, or a family member story?
Right. Well, it's interesting because I used to teach a memoir writing class at the College for Creative Studies. And there was an older gentleman was one of my students, and he was single. He had never married, never had kids, but he had nephews. And he wanted to write his memoir to just not to get published, but just to pass on his story to his nephews so they would know that part of the family history. So people that are interested, and I know I sound like a broken record, but get the oral histories of your family. That is the first step. And if there are older people in the family, do it while they're still sharp and still remember, and pick a time when, right after a meal and everybody's full and happy, and you know what I mean? Don't do it when they, just read the latest news report and they're, not feeling like talking or whatever. And I also encourage people to keep a journal, just to write down your thoughts, because even things that you get from these oral histories, just let it kind of churn in your head. Write a journal and go back to it and reread what you wrote and whatnot. And it also helps you, by keeping that journal, gets you in the habit of writing. Because if you're going to write a memoir or write fiction based on your history, if you're going to fictionalize it, you have to be a writer. And I find that keeping a journal is the best way to start writing. It's just between you and your book. No one's reading it. You aren't getting graded on it. It's not an assignment. And I think that's a very good way just to get the writing process started.
Thank you. And now I have a very important question for you. How do we find out more information about you, and how do we get your books? Please share that with everybody.
I'd love to share it. You can go to my website, which is jeanaliciaelster.com. And in fact, if you see it spelled out on my book here, and I'm sure you've got it on the library's website where you're talking about the event, you can go to my website, and the links there will take you directly to Wayne State University Press. and you can order the books there. You can order How It Happens. And if you want all three, you can get the colored car and Who's Jim Hines. And also I encourage people to patronize your favorite local independent bookstore. And right there near the library is a Book Beat. And Colleen keeps a lot of, in fact, she keeps my books in stock. In fact, whenever she gets a new order of them, she'll send me an email, can you come in and autograph them? So you may even be able to get an autographed copy if you go there. But if you're watching this from somewhere else, if you have another favorite independent bookstore, really patronize them, because they are really small businesses in the community, but they keep their fingers on the pulse of the community, what people like to read and what they're interested in. So I really encourage people, you can order it online from my publisher, order it from your favorite bookstore, even Barnes & Noble. Who would have thought that Barnes & Noble would be the last chain standing? But they've been very supportive of my books through the years. So that's a way to do it. And like I said, BookBeat will probably have some autographed copies too. And I do school visits too. On my website, I have what you call the educator resources and their educator guides. So if any of the folks reading this are teachers, or if you're students and you can recommend to your teacher, I love to do visits similar to what I did here for the library.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it to the group. Does anybody else have any questions?
Are there any questions in the chat? I can't tell.
Not tonight. All right. Do you have any words of wisdom you'd like to leave us with?
Oh, well, I just really appreciate being invited tonight. This has been an absolute joy talking to your readers. And I know you've recorded this, so if folks are watching the recording, I'm just thrilled to be able to connect and really reach out. You can contact me on my website. There's a little contact page if you have any questions. But I encourage you to use the reader's guide and the study guides to help you through the books. I've got reading guides there for Who's Jim Hines and the colored car as well. So I kind of like to help my readers delve into it, and use your and I'm speaking now to people viewing this. Use your librarians as a resource, and they're happy to help you. And please invite me back again if you're having another program or whatever. This has been an absolute joy. Thank you.
Well,
We appreciate you. Yes. Hopefully in person next time.
Yeah.
Yes.
I love that. I would love to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Jean Alicia. This has been wonderful to have you here. Your words and your story are so powerful, and I hope that this recording and this program helps to spread that word of your family's story and, and how to talk to your family members. I love your tips about that.
Great, good. Well, I hope I've inspired some people through that.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jean Alicia.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.